This is the Talking Archive. My name is Josh Jacobs, and last time we were talking with Ted Ziegenbusch and his early days at KMN 129 Radio in San Bernardino back in the early 1960s. This was a top 40 powerhouse station that at one point 45% of those listening to the radio at one time were listening to KMN. And Ted, thanks for being with us again.
Oh, thank you, Josh.
Now, you interned there at the age of 12, and tell us about some of your favorite DJs you got to hang out with there.
Well, everything was in short spurts because the first day when I came home after being on Bill Watson's show and him having me in the control room, and I went home and told my mom and dad the story. They had dropped me off there and then picked me up because I wasn't driving at 12. Imagine that. But I told my mom, and my mom said, "Does that guy know how old you are?" And I was pretty big for my age. Even in the sixth grade, I was 6 feet tall. So I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, I kind of wonder if he knew you were 12 years old, if they let you hang around like that." I said, "Well, I'm not going to bring it up. I'm having too much fun, And they would tell me, they would say things like, "Well, hey, come back anytime." And I don't know if they were being polite or what, but they seemed to like having somebody who was super interested in what they were doing. And I wasn't like a gushy fan of them as much as I was of what they were doing, their craft and doing their shows. And I had a chance to hang out for a short time with Johnny Darren, who was really a wonderful guy. And it was kind of funny how coincidentally decades later, I would run into him at the kitchen of another radio station where I was working. And I said, "Hey, Johnny, I don't know if you remember me or not, but I was the little intern kid who hung around KMN back in the 60s. "Oh, my gosh." He shook my hand, and, Johnny Darren went on from KMN to being the program director at KRLA in Pasadena and other things after that, including he was, at one point, they kind of called him the infomercial king on television because he produced a lot of infomercials that were really popular back then.
That's right. In fact, I remember meeting him here myself at it's probably the same radio station that we were at. And he was very friendly. And the funny thing is, the second time I met him, he had a beard and I didn't recognize him. He was like, "Hi, what's your name?" He's like, "Hi, I'm John Darren." I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't even recognize you with the beard." But he was cool about it.
Yeah. Well, the guys had a tendency to do that. I guess whatever the trend was at the time, they would kind of change their look a bit. One of the guys who came shortly after I started there, because there was a turnover, believe it or not, even at a popular station, you have guys that try to go on to bigger and better things, or you have guys that want to go back to their hometown and they're not really comfortable in a big city like San Bernardino. But John Ravenscroft, who later was known as John Peel on the BBC in England, he did the 7 to midnight show for a while. Actually, I think it was 6 to 10 might have been the shift, but he would hang around the radio station, and this guy was what we called in those days mod. He had a big, wide leather belt that he wore on his pants. He had wide corduroys that became popular about then. He had big black Tom McAn boots with a zipper that you would zip the boot on your foot. And he had Flower Child long sleeve shirt, that was, I guess, popular in London in those days, and it worked its way over here. So he looked like, at the time, he really stood out because he was kind of a trendsetter or followed the trend that was on the way. And he was an interesting character. I didn't interact with him too much, but it was fun. In later years, more as we approached more like 1968, I got to know Johnny Helm, the nighttime guy, and I spent a lot of time with Johnny Helm because he did the nighttime show, and he enjoyed having me there as company. I would, when I got done with my homework from high school, I would come over there and hang out with him. And eventually they had something called the high school news, where once a week you would come on, and for 90 seconds, you would get to talk about what was going on at your high school. And they asked me one day, without advertising, they said, "Hey, you go to the high school right behind the radio station here, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." "Well, how'd you like to be our high school reporter?" I said, "Hey, that'd be great." And so I started doing that, every week during the school year. I would go in and record my high school news, and they would play that, which again opened up more opportunities. More people got to know me on the staff, and made it easier for me to hang out at the radio station. And that was about the time in my drama class when somebody said, if you like radio that much, they have classes at San Bernardino Valley College that teach you radio production and television, and you can actually sit and do a show on an FM station at the college. And when I heard about that, I immediately said, "How soon can I do that?" Well, you have to graduate from high school before you can take.
Oh, so you weren't allowed back then. Sometimes today you can go to take a JC class, but I guess back then you couldn't do that.
Yeah. So that particular class, I could start the summer that I graduated, June of '69. I immediately signed up for classes and got my foot in the door and started doing that. And then when I heard, about, hey, you can go to school, you're going to need something called a first-class radio telephone license if you're going to be a DJ, because if you're ever left alone at the radio station, you're responsible for the transmitter. And if anything goes wrong, you might be the guy that has to touch something, and you have to know what you're doing. So you have to get this license. And I was kind of familiar with the concept because my mom was a beautician, and when we moved out here from Ohio to California, she had to go to beauty school to get her California license to do people's hair and things like that. And so I found out about, the school. They had two schools basically back then in the Hollywood, Orange County area that you could go study to take your test. It wasn't a California test; it was a national test. But and you could pass the test and get your license. And I knew I had to do that if I was ever going to be left alone at a radio station. So I went to school, got my license. It was easier than I thought, although it took 8 weeks of 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Well, actually, it was 9 to 8. We even went longer than that. But got my license, which allowed me to, be alone at a radio station. And so when Cayman was offered the opportunity to run American Top 40 with Casey Kasem, they needed somebody on Sunday mornings to run the show. And because I had the license and I guess right time, right place, they said, would you be interested in coming in and running, Casey's Top 40 Countdown? I said, yeah, hey, sure. And so that was my first real paid job, with the station. And Cayman was one of the, I think it was less than 10, stations that first week or two that ran Casey's show. And so Cayman was one of the very first stations to run American Top 40. And I was responsible for stopping the thing and inserting the commercials in between the breaks. And if things didn't add up and we were getting next to the end of the hour and we didn't want to start Casey's next hour, I had to fill with oldies, not current songs, to get us to the top of the hour. And so I had a list that I could pick from, and I actually got to pick what I got to play. That was fun. Hey, I actually get to pick the song.
So you're praying for fewer commercials so that way you can pick what you want to play.
Yeah, that was my first paid gig, at Cayman. I say unpaid intern. Believe me, they gave me lots of vinyl records and other things over the years as payment, as perks, for helping them out. But to actually get a paycheck and real money, that was kind of cool.
Also, I had a question about Casey's Top 40. Did the show come on reel-to-reel or LP records?
Originally, it came on reel-to-reel. Mm-hmm. And there was always the concern, that the magnetic tape might break or something might happen. And they were always concerned that you had to be really skillful with fast forwarding or moving the reel-to-reel tape without breaking it. Because if you broke it, what are you going to do? You're going to have to put an oldie on or something to fill the time while you're fixing the tape that broke. And I think that's probably what shortly thereafter Watermark, the company that was producing the show, started coming out with the vinyl albums that they were all in a box that was sent UPS or something to the station every week. And I'm sure just like when they sent it reel to reel, the station was a little bit panicked until the day that it showed up, and then they knew, okay, we got this weekend show. It's going to be there.
Yeah, because I remember when I first interned, this was back in 1992 for Oldies 93 CBS FM. We were running the show Cousin Brucey's Cruising America. And then suddenly the program director changed his mind and says, we're not going to run Cousin Brucey anymore. Instead, we're going to be running the history of rock and roll, which was hosted by Bill Drake, who ironically was a consultant for competing oldies station K Earth 101. But it was never known who the host was. It just, each episode began with, the history of rock and roll continues now with the Eagles. And then this is the history of rock and roll. But they never, I think they edited out the Drake saying his own name. But I remember it came on LP, and I thought, wow, that's just strange, because by that time, CDs were pretty much the norm, and Cousin Brucey's show came on CD, so it was just weird seeing them transferring it from an LP to a reel-to-reel to play back that Sunday.
Yeah, it was. I wasn't at Drake. I later interviewed with Gene Chenault for a job with the company. That would have been, in well into the 80s. But I heard, there was Mark Ford that had been doing middays in the late 60s at Cayman. He left Cayman for the job of production director at Drake Chenault. So he actually helped produce the history of rock and roll. But I've heard stories that, not mistakes, but there were a lot of weird things and weird decisions that were made about production and how things were sent to other stations. And it seems like, it's true what they say. As soon as you think you've got a certain technology, within 2 years, you've got some other technology that's even better. I mean, I remember in San Diego when one of the stations, they were all excited for digital tape recorders, and I mean, they thought it was going to be Ted, you're looking at the future. This is going to be the future of radio, digital tape recorders. And of course, who's got a digital tape recorder anymore?
I'm trying to remember what a digital tape recorder even was.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of like they said about, AM stereo. That was the big thing in the early 80s. AM stereo, they kept on saying that over and over again.
Yeah.
But the problem was that there were so many different formats of AM stereo that nobody could figure out or come to an agreement which one to use. Unlike color television, where RCA's color TV patent is the one that became the standard for everybody else.
Right. Yeah, it's a shame because, AM stereo sounded good, as I recall, and I've seen other people who still say, it's too bad it didn't really make it because it really improved things a lot. But I got to tell you, I mean, I was the program director of the Mighty 690 down in San Diego, which you could hear in Los Angeles and San Bernardino back in the early 80s. I ran that station, And I left there to go to KGB in San Diego, which was another AM station and pretty legendary. Art Linkletter and different people had worked there. And it was a thrill for me to do middays, on KGB.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the legend that the station had. But my timing couldn't have been more perfect to move into FM, because little did I know that the early 80s was the end of AM music. Radio stations were suddenly, losing audience. I mean, it was just ridiculous. One day you'd be number one in town, and the next day it's like, where did the audience go? How could that happen? Well, they were moving in droves to the FM stations. No matter whether it was San Diego, Los Angeles, or wherever. And people would flip formats. They'd go from top 40 to oldies. They'd try everything to try to save the AM. And with the exception of KFI, that finally figured out that talk radio or even sports radio, those two things were the savior of most AM stations. I feel lucky that I got off the AM and onto the FM at the time that I did, because it seemed like you were going to have more opportunities and more options than if you continued down the path of trying to do top 40 on AM. We loved it. It was a great era. It was fun. I mean, it was the thing at that time, but like everything else, vinyl records and 8-track tapes and CDs, I mean, the next big thing's on the way, so move over.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I remember as a kid, my dad always had the FM band on. My dad was, the quintessential hippie. He almost went to Woodstock, except the problem was his car broke down in Quebec somewhere. But the line was so long to Woodstock, my dad might as well just walked, because he would at least have avoided the traffic jam once he left Woodstock. But actually it was about 100 miles away, but it seemed like it was hundreds of miles away as far as the parking was concerned. But my dad told me this one lesson as a kid. He says, Josh, AM is in mono and has lots of commercials. FM's in stereo and has very few commercials. At least that's the way it was back then. We were listening to, I think, K-West 106, KMET, KNX-FM. I think a little bit of KLOS, but my dad didn't really like KLOS. He liked K-West 106, I think, the best of all of them.
Right.
But now, speaking of Top 40, how did you finally get to be hired as an on-air personality at KMN?
Well, it's a funny story, and it sounds a bit similar to the story I always heard about Steven Spielberg and how he worked his way into Universal Studios or wherever it was. I was there running the overnight show. On the weekends, they gave the weekend guy worked 6 days a week. The overnight guy that did midnight to 6, and that was the shift back then at KMN in the 60s. Believe me, and even early 70s. That's a long, tough shift. I mean, they got paid extra. It wasn't much, but you got paid a little extra for working overnights in those days. And then on the one night, Sunday night, Monday morning, they would replay an hour. The guy would record, if you can believe this, and I don't know how they kept track of what songs had played, but he would record 1 hour on Monday, 1 hour on Tuesday, 1 hour. You get the idea. Mm-hmm. And then on Sunday night, Monday morning, we would replay 6 different hours on 6 different nights of his show, and that would be his overnight show. They didn't hire an overnight guy or weekend guys for those kind of shifts, for the overnight shift. So again, I had the first class license, and so that was my job. In addition to the Casey thing, I would do that and help out. So on this particular night, I was replaying, I believe Jay London was the name of the guy that was our overnight guy in those days. And I got to the 5 o'clock hour. I started queuing it up about 4:45, 10 minutes till 5. and there was nothing on the tape. I started listening to the tape, and it's going wah 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 wah, and I'm hitting fast forward, and I'm hearing nothing but wah 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 wah. And I thought, there's nothing on here. Oh my God, what am I going to do? I can't wake somebody up at 4:45 in the morning. And nobody, coincidentally, nobody had really given me explicit instructions as to what to do. And I thought, well, I'll just go in the studio and play songs, and hit the jingles and play the commercials where they're supposed to be. And, mornings is important to people. I better come in occasionally and say, it's 5:15 it came in, and here's the Beach Boys or whatever I played. And, I was already doing my training and shows at the Valley College, so it wasn't like I'd never done this before. It's just I'd never been on Cayman. And so I did that, and I didn't overindulge. I didn't do too much, but apparently I did more than I was supposed to. Because when the morning guy, Robert E. Walker, walked in the door, he was the morning guy that did 6 to 10 in those days. He walked in, and he looked pale as a ghost, and he said, "Ted, what are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean? What are you doing? Where's Jay's show? Why are you doing this?" And I said, well, there was nothing on the tape, and I didn't know what else to do. And he said, "Well, you didn't need to talk. You could have just played the songs." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry. I thought I was doing, the right thing." And we kind of left it at that, and I packed up at 6 o'clock and went home. So later in the afternoon, the phone rings, and I pick it up. "Hello? Yeah, Ted, this is Dave McCormick." And that was the program director at Cayman at the time. And I said, "Yeah, Dave, what's up?" He goes, "Hey, I hear you had a little problem overnight with the overnight show." And I said, "Yeah, I don't know what happened, but I got to the 5 o'clock hour and it was completely empty. I kind of panicked, and, I just went in. I followed format, because I watched you guys do it. I knew what to play in what order, and, I did some time checks and stuff like that." He goes, "Well, wouldn't have recommended that. I hear you did really well. Maybe you got a future doing this."
Wow.
And I thought, wow, nice.
This is the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and Ted Ziegenbusch just told us the story about how he was first on the air at Cayman. Next time, we're going to find out what happened after that. And Ted, we'll look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Josh.